close your eyes for just a moment. I want you to imagine something. Imagine you are standing in a room full of native English speakers. They are laughing, debating, storytelling, interrupting each other, making jokes. The conversation is flying, and you are standing right there in the middle of it. You understand most of what they are saying. You know the vocabulary. You have studied English for years. You passed your exams. You scored well on every test your teachers gave you. You know the grammar rules better than some native speakers do. But your mouth is frozen. Someone turns to you and asks a simple question. Something like, "So what do you think about that?" And your brain immediately translates the question into your native language. You think of an answer in your native language, then you try to translate that answer back into English, and by the time the words are ready, the conversation has already moved forward. The moment is gone. You smile politely and say something safe, something short, something that barely scratches the surface of what you actually wanted to say. You walk away frustrated, not because you do not know English, but because your brain is still thinking in your native language and then trying to translate. And that one extra step, that translation gap, is destroying your fluency in real time. This is the single most common problem that holds back advanced learners of English all over the world. You know English, but you do not yet think in English, and there is a profound difference between those two things. Today, that changes. What you are about to do in this video is not a passive listening exercise. You are not going to sit back and absorb content. You are going to participate. You are going to speak. You are going to shadow me, which means you will repeat what I say almost at the same time I say it, just a few words behind, like an echo. And over the next hour, we are going to train your brain through carefully structured, progressively challenging shadowing sessions that target the exact mechanisms responsible for real-time thinking in English. By the end of this session, if you do the work, if you actually open your mouth and shadow every single sentence, your brain will begin to experience what it feels like to produce English without translation. That feeling, that first moment when a thought arrives in English before it arrives in your native language, is one of the most powerful breakthroughs an English learner can experience. And we are going to chase that breakthrough together right now in this session. Before we begin, let me tell you what shadowing actually is and why it works so powerfully that professional interpreters, diplomats, and language coaches have used it as their primary training tool for decades. Shadowing is the practice of listening to someone speak and repeating what they say almost simultaneously, a breath or two behind. Not after, not when the sentence is finished. While it is happening, you are chasing the speaker's voice with your own voice. Your ears are receiving language at the exact same moment your mouth is producing language. This forces your brain into a completely different mode than normal study. When you read English, your brain has time to think. When you listen to English, your brain has time to process and analyze. But when you shadow English, your brain has no time for translation. It must operate in the language itself. It must trust the patterns. It must let the words flow without stopping to question every choice. And this is precisely the mental environment in which fluency is built. Fluency is not the absence of mistakes. Fluency is the presence of flow. And flow can only be trained by doing exactly what fluency demands, which is producing language in real time, under pressure, without the luxury of translation. Here is how this session is structured. We are going to move through 7 lessons. Each lesson has a specific goal. The topics will become more complex as we move forward. The sentence structures will become more sophisticated. The vocabulary will become richer. But the core practice remains the same throughout. Listen, shadow, keep your voice close to mine. Do not stop when you make a mistake. Do not rewind. Do not pause. Keep going. Because in real conversation, you cannot rewind, you cannot pause, you can only move forward. And your brain needs to learn how to do exactly that. One final instruction before we begin. Find a space where you can speak out loud. If you are in public, use headphones and speak quietly. But speak. Do not do this silently in your head. Silent shadowing is like trying to build muscle by imagining the gym. The physical act of producing sound, of moving your mouth, your tongue, your jaw, your lips, of pushing air through your throat and forming words, that is what trains the motor pathways in your brain that fluency depends on. Speaking is not optional in this exercise. It is the entire point. Are you ready? Let us begin. Lesson 1. Daily Rhythm Sentences. We start with the most natural English in existence. The sentences of everyday life. The thoughts people have when they wake up, move through their day, interact with the world, and wind down at night. These sentences are short, they are rhythmic, they carry the natural stress patterns and contractions of spoken English. They are the perfect foundation for shadowing because your body learns the music of English before it has to wrestle with the complexity of English. Shadow everything I say, stay close, here we go. I woke up before my alarm this morning and just lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything I needed to do. The first thing I do every morning is make coffee. Not because I particularly love the taste, but because the ritual of making it helps my brain shift into a different gear. I check my phone before I even got out of bed, which I know is a bad habit, but somehow the day does not feel real until I have seen what is waiting for me. There is something about the early morning that feels like possibility. Like the day has not been ruined yet. Like anything could still happen. I took a shower longer than I needed to, just because the hot water felt good and my mind was working through something I had been avoiding thinking about. By the time I was dressed and ready, I had already decided that today was going to be different. I say that to myself more often than I would like to admit. I made breakfast, nothing elaborate, just toast and something to drink, and ate it standing at the counter because sitting down felt like a commitment I was not ready to make. The commute, whether it is on a train, in a car, or just a walk to another room, is the part of the day where I do my best and worst thinking simultaneously. I arrived where I needed to be slightly later than I intended, slightly more tired than I wanted to be, and carrying approximately twice as many thoughts as I had room for. I sat down, I took a breath, I told myself, one thing at a time, and for about 30 seconds, I actually believed it. The morning passed the way mornings do, in a blur of small tasks and interrupted focus and conversations that started somewhere and ended nowhere in particular. By midday, I was hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. That hollow, restless feeling that comes when you are working hard but not quite sure the work is taking you anywhere meaningful. I ate lunch while doing something else, which meant I tasted almost none of it and solved almost none of whatever I was trying to solve. The afternoon is always harder than the morning. The energy drops, the focus gets slippery, the small irritations that you successfully ignored in the first half of the day start to accumulate. But there are moments, even in the hardest afternoons, when something clicks. When a problem that felt impossible 30 minutes ago suddenly reveals its answer. When the work starts to feel like something more than just work. By evening, I was tired in that specific way that means the day was real. Not the exhaustion of boredom, but the heaviness of having actually been somewhere and done something. I made dinner, or someone else did, and we sat together, or maybe I sat alone, and the conversation or the silence felt like exactly what the end of the day needed. Before bed, I did that thing that almost everyone does and almost no one admits to. That final scroll through the phone. That last check to see if anything had changed in the world since I last checked, which was maybe 12 minutes ago. I turned off the light eventually, which is always an act of optimism, a belief that tomorrow is worth being rested for. And as I lay there, not quite asleep, not quite awake, I thought about the day. Not everything I did, just the moments, the ones that felt like they would stick. Sleep, when it came quickly, which is the best kind. Good. Now let us work with some sentences that carry a slightly heavier emotional weight. Daily life is not always neutral. English speakers talk about feelings all the time, indirectly, through the texture of their words. Keep shadowing. There are mornings when you do not want to get up, not because you are tired, but because the bed is the last place where the world is still manageable. Some people are morning people, and some people are night people, and some people are just people who are trying to get through the day regardless of what time it is. The version of yourself that exists at 7 in the morning is fundamentally different from the version that exists at 11 at night, and it is worth asking which one you like better. I have been trying to build a routine, which is a polite way of saying I have been trying to trick my future self into making better decisions. The hardest part of any habit is not doing it once or twice. The hardest part is doing it when you do not feel like it, when there is no reward in sight, and when the version of you who started this whole thing feels very far away. Some days are just maintenance days. You do not grow on maintenance days. You do not make progress. You simply hold the line. And holding the line is its own kind of accomplishment. I have been thinking about what it means to be productive, and I am less and less convinced that busy and productive are even related to each other. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep does not fix. It requires something else. Rest, yes, but the rest of the mind, not just the body. The rest that comes from doing less and noticing more. Every day is made of approximately 1,000 small decisions, and the quality of your life is largely determined by which of those decisions you make consciously and which ones you just let happen to you. At the end of the day, I want to be able to say that I was present, not that I was busy, not that I was productive, just that I was actually there, in my own life, paying attention. Excellent. You are building rhythm. You are building the physical memory of English sentences. Keep going. Do not stop. Lesson 2, storytelling and narrative. Stories are the heart of human communication. When you can tell a story in English confidently, naturally, with the rhythm of a native speaker, you have crossed a threshold that no grammar textbook can take you to. In this lesson, we are going to shadow narrative English, the kind of English that unfolds, that has beginning, middle, and end, that carries the listener somewhere. Your job is not just to repeat the words, but to feel the story unfolding in your mouth as you say it. Shadow every sentence. Keep your voice close. Let me tell you about a conversation I had with a stranger on a train that I have never forgotten. It was a long journey, several hours, and I had settled in with a book I was not really reading, the kind of book you bring on a train, to look thoughtful rather than to actually read. The man sitting across from me was older, maybe in his 60s, with the kind of face that had clearly weathered a great deal without losing its openness. He did not say anything for the first hour. Neither did I. We just existed in that comfortable silence that train travel allows in a way that almost no other situation does. But somewhere around the second hour, he looked up from the window and said, out of nowhere, the hardest thing I ever did was let go of who I thought I was supposed to be. I did not know what to say to that. I was not sure he was even talking to me. But then he looked at me directly and smiled, and I realized he was, and that he had probably been thinking about it for the entire first hour. I spent the first 40 years of my life, he said, becoming someone else's idea of a success. And I was very good at it. And I was very miserable. I put down the book I was not reading and gave him my full attention, which felt like the only appropriate response. And then, he said, I stopped. Not because I had a plan, not because I knew what came next. I stopped because I finally ran out of energy to pretend. He paused and looked back out the window at the landscape, moving past us at a speed that made it look like a painting someone was pulling slowly to the right. The strangest thing happened, he continued. When I stopped pretending, I thought I would feel lost, and I did, for a while. But then, underneath the lostness, there was something else, something quieter, something that had been waiting. I asked him what it was. I know it sounds presumptuous, asking a stranger something that personal, but the conversation had already gone past the point where normal social rules applied. He thought about it for a moment. He was the kind of person who actually thought before he answered, which is rarer than it should be. It was just me, he said finally, without the performance, just the actual thing. Smaller than I expected, honestly, but real, and I had missed it. The train slowed and then stopped at a station I did not recognize, and he stood up and gathered a small bag from the overhead rack with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned not to rush. He paused at the edge of our seats and looked at me one more time. You seem like someone who thinks a lot, he said. That is a good quality. Just make sure you are thinking about the right things. And then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd on the platform, and I never saw him again. I sat with what he had said for the rest of the journey, the book ignored and face down on the empty seat across from me. I do not know who he was. I do not know where he was going or what his life looked like on the other side of that 40-year reinvention. But I have thought about what he said probably 1,000 times since then. The hardest thing I ever did was let go of who I thought I was supposed to be. Some sentences follow you. They move into your mind and refuse to pay rent. They show up at unexpected moments, at 3 in the morning, in the middle of a meeting, at the beginning of a year that feels like it needs a different direction. That one has followed me ever since, and I am still deciding what to do with it. Now let us practice a different kind of storytelling, shorter, more personal, more immediate, the kind of story you tell a friend. There was this one moment last summer that I keep coming back to, and I am not entirely sure why it stuck. We were sitting outside, just a small group of people who knew each other well enough to be comfortable in the silences, and it was the kind of evening that does not announce itself as special. No big occasion, no milestone, just a Tuesday or a Wednesday, warm enough that no one wanted to go inside, cool enough that a light jacket felt like the right decision. Someone had music playing from a phone resting on the table, and nobody was really listening to it, but it was there, filling the background of the evening with something gentle. The conversation drifted in the way conversations do when no one is trying to steer it. From something funny that happened to someone, to something sad that happened to someone else, to something we all agreed on that we could not quite put into words. At some point, the music changed to a song that two people at the table knew from somewhere years earlier, and they both smiled at the same time in the same way. And that moment of shared recognition was so quick and so private that if you had blinked, you would have missed it. I did not blink. I caught it. And I held on to it the way you hold on to things that remind you why being alive is as interesting as it is. We stayed outside until the sky went dark enough that the stars became visible, which happened slowly and then all at once, the way most good things do. Nobody wanted to be the first to leave, so nobody was. We sat until eventually the evening ended on its own, the way good evenings do, without anyone deciding, without anyone noticing the exact moment it became night. I drove home with the windows down and the radio off, just listening to the sound of the road, feeling something that I could not name but did not need to. Some nights are just right, and the right ones teach you something about what you are looking for, even when you have not asked the question yet. Lesson 3. Opinion and discussion. This is where many English learners struggle most. It is one thing to narrate, it is another thing entirely to argue, to reason, to share an opinion with confidence and conviction in real time. In this lesson, you will shadow discussion-style English, the kind of thinking out loud language that native speakers use when they are working through ideas. This trains your brain to express reasoning in English, not translate it. Stay close, shadow everything. I want to talk about something that I think we do not examine carefully enough, which is the relationship between how we spend our time and who we actually become. There is a common idea that character is built through big decisions, through crisis and choice, and the dramatic moments that we all carry around like defining stories, and there is truth in that, but I think it misses something important. I think character is built, far more powerfully, through the 10,000 small things we do without thinking about them, the way we talk to people when we are tired, the choices we make when nobody is watching, the habits that run in the background of our lives like software we have never thought to update. The big moments reveal character, but the small, repeated moments, those are where character is actually constructed, one quiet decision at a time. And this matters enormously when we think about change, because if we believe that character is built in the dramatic moments, then change feels like it requires a dramatic moment too, a turning point, a rock bottom, an epiphany. And we wait for those things, sometimes for years, while our habits continue quietly building the person we say we want to stop being. But if character is built in the small, repeated moments, then change is available every single day. Not in some future moment of crisis, but in the breakfast you choose, in the conversation you decide to have or not have, in the 10 minutes before bed that you give to a book instead of a screen. The scale of the change required is almost offensively small, which is, paradoxically, why most people never make it, because we want change to feel proportional to the size of our suffering. We want a transformation that matches the drama of how stuck we feel, and 5 minutes of reading before bed does not feel like transformation. It feels like almost nothing, but it is almost nothing, done every night for a year, that becomes everything. That is how it works. And knowing how it works and actually doing it are two very different kinds of knowing. I am also interested in this question of what it means to be good at something versus what it means to love something. We live in a culture that conflates these two things constantly. We tell children to pursue what they are good at. We admire people who reach the top of their fields. And we quietly assume that being excellent at something must mean loving it, must mean it was the right path all along. But I have met enough people at the peak of their fields to know that excellence and love are not the same territory. There are brilliant surgeons who are indifferent to surgery. There are exceptional lawyers who find the law tedious. There are people who have spent 30 years mastering something they were never particularly interested in, who did it because they were told they were talented, and who followed that talent the way you follow a road, without ever asking where it goes. And on the other side of this, there are people who love something deeply, who return to it every day, who light up when they talk about it, who are objectively only average at it by competitive standards, and who are more alive doing that average thing than the excellent people are doing their excellent things? This is not an argument against excellence. Excellence is worth pursuing, but I think we need to be honest about what we are pursuing it for, and we need to stop treating talent as a moral directive. The fact that you are good at something does not mean you are obligated to build your life around it. Permission to do the thing you love badly is one of the most underrated forms of freedom. Let me say something about technology, because I think we are at a genuinely confusing moment in history, and the confusion is not a failure of intelligence. It is an appropriate response to a genuinely unprecedented situation. The pace of technological change has outrun our cultural ability to process it. And I do not mean that in a dystopian way. I mean it in a very practical, very human way. Every previous generation of humans learned how to live from people who had already lived. The knowledge of how to navigate a human life was transmitted relatively reliably from older people to younger ones. Not perfectly, not always wisely. But the rate of change was slow enough that what your parents knew about life was still mostly relevant by the time you needed to know it yourself. That inheritance is breaking down. Not because older people have nothing to offer, they have an enormous amount to offer, but because the specific landscape of daily life is changing so fast that the map your parents drew for you may not accurately describe the territory you are actually walking through. And this creates a kind of orphanhood in the realm of wisdom. A generation of people who have to figure things out without a reliable guide, who have to build frameworks for navigating information, attention, relationships, and identity in a world that is substantially different from any world that has existed before. And what I find remarkable, genuinely remarkable, is how many people are doing exactly that. Quietly, persistently, without fanfare, millions of people are building their own philosophies of life from scratch, reading widely, thinking carefully, making mistakes and learning from them in ways that their circumstances demand. That is not collapse, that is adaptation, and it is happening faster and with more intelligence and more good faith than the headlines would ever lead you to believe. Lesson 4. Emotional Intelligence Language. Now we go deeper into the language of human experience, the sentences that carry the weight of how we actually feel about our lives, our relationships, and ourselves. This is where English learners often have the biggest gap, not because they lack vocabulary, but because they have never practiced producing emotional truth in English. They have only ever done that in their native language. We are going to change that right now. Keep your voice close to mine, shadow every word. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. It is the loneliness of being misunderstood by people who love you, of having your most important parts consistently unseen by the people whose seeing matters most. That kind of loneliness is quieter than ordinary loneliness. It does not announce itself. It simply grows over months and years in the gap between who you are and who the people around you think you are. And the strange thing is that this loneliness can coexist with a full and busy life. You can be surrounded by family and friends and colleagues and still carry this particular ache of invisibility, which makes it very hard to name and very hard to solve and very hard to even admit to yourself without feeling ungrateful. Gratitude is complicated for people who carry this kind of loneliness, because the loneliness sits inside a life that is, in many measurable ways, good. And the difficulty of saying, I am loved but not seen, I am cared for but not known, is that it sounds, even to your own ears, like ingratitude. But it is not. It is just honesty. And naming it clearly is the first step toward doing something about it. I want to talk about grief for a moment. Not the acute grief of fresh loss, though that deserves its own careful attention, but the other kind. The grief that has been living in you for a long time. The grief that is no longer sharp but has become structural. That has become part of the architecture of how you move through the world. This kind of grief is not dramatic. It does not arrive in waves the way people describe grief arriving. It is more like weather. A low-pressure system that has been sitting over your interior landscape for so long that you have mostly forgotten what the weather was like before it arrived. People do not talk much about this kind of grief because it is hard to point to a cause. The acute grief of losing someone is legible. People understand it. They bring you food and sit with you and ask how you are doing. But the grief of something more diffuse, of a childhood that was not safe enough, of a version of your life that never happened, of a self that was slowly given away in too many directions, that grief does not have a clear ceremony. You grieve it alone, mostly, in the spaces between things, On the drive home, in the shower, in the moment just before sleep when the defenses are down and the truth of what you carry becomes briefly visible, the work of addressing this kind of grief is slow and non-linear and often not recognized as grief work at all. It looks like therapy, sometimes, like long walks, like certain conversations, like deciding, finally, after years of not deciding, that something in your life has to change. And the relief of it, when it comes, also does not announce itself. It is not a breakthrough. It is more like a gradual lightening, a slow discovery that the weight is slightly less than it was, that you are slightly more able to breathe than you were. That is enough. That is real progress, even when it does not feel like enough. Let me talk about joy, because we have talked about the hard things, and joy deserves equal time and equal seriousness. Joy is not the same as happiness. Happiness is a sustained emotional state. Joy is a moment. It is present tense, fully and only present tense. It does not carry the past or worry about the future. It lives entirely in the now of whatever is happening. Joy arrives unexpectedly, which is one of its most reliable characteristics. You cannot schedule it, you cannot guarantee it by doing the right things. You can create conditions that make it more likely. But joy, ultimately, chooses its own moments. It arrives when the light hits something the right way and you notice. When someone laughs in a particular way and your whole body responds. When you are doing something that asks everything of you and you are equal to the demand. When you realize, mid-sentence, that you are talking to exactly the right person. Joy is promiscuous. It does not care about your status or your productivity or whether you have been good enough lately. It arrives for children running through water on a hot day and for old people watching the same sunset they have watched 1,000 times. And joy, unlike happiness, does not require that everything be okay. Some of the most intense moments of joy I have ever heard described came from people in very difficult circumstances. People who found the quality of a particular moment so overwhelming that the difficulty temporarily ceased to exist. This is not toxic positivity. This is not the instruction to look on the bright side while things are genuinely terrible. This is the observation that joy and difficulty can occupy the same moment. That suffering does not cancel joy's visa. That beauty, when it arrives, does not check your emotional bank balance before it lets you in. There is also the joy that comes specifically from other people, from connection that is real and mutual and free of performance. The moment when you say something true and the person across from you says, yes, exactly, yes, I know exactly what you mean, and you feel the cellular recognition of being understood, not just heard, but genuinely understood by another human being. That is a specific and irreplaceable kind of joy that nothing else in human experience provides. Not success, not solitude, not beauty in any of its forms. Only another person who really sees you can give you that. And this is why loneliness is not just painful. It is impoverishing. It closes off an entire category of human experience that nothing else can replace. Connection matters. Not polite connection. Not transactional connection. The real kind. The kind where you put down your performance for a while and let someone actually see you and they stay anyway. That kind of connection is worth more than almost anything else you could build your life around. And it requires the courage to be seen, which is, for most of us, the scariest kind of courage there is. Lesson 5. Complex argumentation and abstract thinking. We are now in the most challenging zone of this session. Here, the English becomes denser, the reasoning becomes more intricate, the sentences become longer and more layered. This is the English of intellectual discourse. The English you hear in TED Talks, in serious podcasts, in the conversations of educated people thinking carefully about difficult ideas. Shadowing this level of English will stretch your brain significantly. That is the point. Stay with it. Keep your voice close even when it becomes difficult, especially when it becomes difficult. Shadow. Now. I have been thinking about the difference between complicated and complex, because I believe this distinction matters enormously both for how we understand problems and for how we attempt to solve them. A complicated problem is difficult, but ultimately manageable with sufficient expertise. Building a commercial aircraft is complicated. It involves thousands of interdependent parts and systems, and very few people in the world fully understand all of them simultaneously. But it is nonetheless the kind of problem that yields to systematic analysis. You can map it, You can separate the components, you can assign experts to each domain, you can test and verify and correct. The difficulty is real, but the path forward, while arduous, is fundamentally legible. A complex problem is different in kind, not just in degree. A complex problem involves elements that interact in ways that are not predictable from examining the elements individually. Small changes in one part of the system produce disproportionate effects in other parts. The behavior of the whole cannot be understood by analyzing the parts in isolation. Expertise in one area is not sufficient, and may even be misleading, because it can generate false confidence that the system operates by the same rules as its component parts. Raising a child is complex. Designing an economy is complex. Managing the culture of an organization is complex. Addressing any deeply rooted social problem is complex. And the reason this distinction matters is that we routinely apply complicated problem thinking to complex problems. We assume that if we just get enough expertise, enough data, enough analysis, we can map the system completely and therefore control it. And complex systems respond to this kind of hubris by producing surprises, by evolving around our interventions, by generating consequences we did not model. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a counsel of epistemic humility. Complex problems can be engaged with. They can even be improved, but they require a different kind of thinking than complicated problems do. They require tolerance for uncertainty. They require iterative approaches that learn and adapt. They require the willingness to hold a hypothesis lightly and revise it in response to what the system actually does, rather than what your model predicted it should do. And they require, above all, the intellectual honesty to admit when you do not know, which turns out to be one of the hardest skills in all of human cognition. I want to explore the question of narrative and identity, because I think we underestimate how much the stories we tell about ourselves determine the lives we actually live. Every person is walking around with a story. Not one story, a constellation of stories. Stories about who they are, stories about where they came from, stories about what they deserve and what they are capable of, stories about how the world works and where they fit within it. These stories did not appear from nowhere. They were constructed, mostly in childhood, mostly from the material of experience and the interpretations that were available to us at the time. And they were constructed by children, which means they were constructed by people who were doing their very best to make sense of a world that was frequently confusing and sometimes frightening with the interpretive tools available to a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old. Which means they are almost certainly, in significant ways, wrong. Not wrong as in false. The events happened, the feelings were real, but the interpretations, the meaning-making, the conclusions drawn about self and world, those are the conclusions of a child operating with incomplete information under conditions that often did not support accurate self-assessment. And then we grow up and carry these stories into our adult lives as though they were facts, as though they were the truth about us rather than early drafts written by someone who was not yet in a position to write with much accuracy. The work of psychological maturity is, in substantial part, the work of revising these stories, of picking them up and examining them with the tools of an adult, of asking, is this story still true? Was it ever true? Who benefits from me continuing to believe it? What would be possible if I let it go? And this is genuinely difficult work because stories do not just live in our minds. They live in our bodies. They live in the automatic reactions we have before thought catches up. They live in the patterns we repeat without noticing we are repeating them. They live in the things we tell ourselves we want that are actually the things we were told we should want. Revising a narrative at that depth requires more than intellectual insight. It requires the willingness to feel the discomfort of uncertainty, of not knowing who you are when the old story no longer fits, before the new story has fully formed. But the alternative, living indefinitely inside a story that was not authored by you and does not fit you, is its own kind of suffering. Slower, quieter, and often harder to diagnose than the discomfort of change. Let me say something about attention, because I think it is arguably the most important resource in human life, and the one we treat with the most casual carelessness. Attention is finite, profoundly, non-negotiably finite. You have only so much of it per day, and whatever you spend it on grows, in your awareness, in your emotional life, in your thinking, in your habits. Whatever you withdraw it from diminishes. This is not metaphor, this is neuroscience. The world has understood this for a long time. Every advertiser, every algorithm, every media organization, every person who has ever tried to persuade you of anything has been operating on the basis of this understanding. They know that whoever gets your attention gets a piece of your reality. They know that the things you pay attention to become the things you believe are important, regardless of whether they actually are. And yet most of us treat our attention as though it is an infinite resource, as though scrolling for 20 minutes costs nothing, as though reading the same distressing news for the fourth time that day is a neutral activity, as though the cumulative effect of 1,000 small attention deposits into things that make us anxious or envious or outraged is somehow separate from the quality of the mind we bring to everything else we do. It is not separate, it is connected. The quality of your attention is the quality of your mind, and the quality of your mind is substantially determined by what you consistently attend to. This does not mean the answer is to withdraw from the world. The answer is to attend to it deliberately, to make choices about where your attention goes rather than simply surrendering it to whoever is most aggressive about claiming it, to ask, before you open an app or click a link or start a conversation, not just what this is about, but what attending to this will do to me. What kind of mind will I have at the end of this experience that I did not have at the beginning? Because attention is not just a resource, it is a practice. And like all practices, it shapes the practitioner. Lesson 6, Conversational Fluency Under Pressure. We are going to shift register now. Back to conversational English, but at a much higher level of sophistication. This is the English of quick wit, of thinking on your feet, of holding your own in a fast-moving conversation. In real English conversations, people are not always slow and deliberate. They are quick, they interrupt, they redirect, they laugh, they challenge, they concede. Shadowing this level of conversational English is critical for real-world fluency. Stay on it, keep pace. Shadow everything? Look, I hear what you are saying and I think you are right about the broad strokes. But there is a detail here that I think changes the picture significantly, and I want to make sure we are accounting for it. Here's the thing. I have heard this argument before, and every time I hear it, I think it is almost right. The word almost is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Can I just push back on one part of that? Because I think if we accept that premise, we are accepting something that sounds reasonable, but actually has some pretty uncomfortable implications. I am not saying you are wrong. I am saying that I think we might be asking the wrong question, and if we are asking the wrong question, then it does not matter how right our answer is. You know what? That is a really interesting way to frame it, and I want to sit with that for a second, because I think it might actually reframe the whole discussion in a way that is useful. Okay, so let me test this. If what you are saying is true, then what would we expect to see? And is that what we are actually seeing? Because those two things have to line up. I want to agree with you, genuinely. I can see why that conclusion is attractive. But I keep running into this one thing that does not fit, and I cannot just ignore it. Here is my honest reaction to that. My first instinct was to disagree completely, and then I thought about it more carefully, and I arrived at this uncomfortable middle ground where I think you are right about the situation but wrong about the cause. Let me try to put my position more precisely, because I think I have been speaking in a way that makes it sound more extreme than it is. What I am actually saying is narrower than what you think I am saying, and I suspect that if I say it more precisely, we might actually agree. I do not know. And I want to be clear that I am saying that genuinely, not as a rhetorical maneuver. There are things here I simply do not have enough information to be confident about. That is a fair point, and I am going to give it more credit than my initial reaction suggested, because I think you are onto something real, even if I am not sure I would go as far as you are going. The thing I keep coming back to is this. Why does this matter? Not in a dismissive way, genuinely. What are the real-world stakes here? Because I think the stakes determine how carefully we need to be with the argument. Okay. Let us try something. Let us just assume for a moment that you are completely right. Let us take your position at full strength and follow it wherever it goes. Because I think when we do that, we discover some things that are not entirely comfortable for either of us. I have been in this conversation now for a while, and I think what is happening is that we are both right about different parts of something that neither of us has managed to describe completely yet. And maybe that is the more useful thing to figure out. You know what changed my mind about this? It was not an argument. Arguments almost never change my mind in real time. It was a specific example that did not fit my model. And once I saw it, I could not unsee it. The most honest thing I can say is that I think this is genuinely hard, and I respect people who disagree with me on it, as long as they have actually thought about it, which, to be fair, not everyone has. I have a question, and I am going to ask it bluntly because I think the polite version obscures what I am actually trying to understand. Can I tell you what I find most interesting about this conversation? It is not the disagreement. It is what the disagreement is revealing about what each of us is actually prioritizing, and I think that is worth making explicit. Look, at the end of the day, reasonable people can disagree on this, and I am comfortable saying I might be wrong, but I want the version of me that might be wrong to have made the best argument it could before conceding. So let me try once more. This is the kind of conversation I wish I had more of. Not because we are reaching any grand conclusion, but because the thinking is actually getting better as we go. That almost never happens. Now, some faster, more casual exchanges. Honestly, I had the exact same thought, which either means we are both right or we are both falling for the same thing. No, I get it, I do. I just think the timing is off, not the idea, the timing. Wait, say that again. Say that more slowly. Because I think you just said something important and I almost missed it. Yeah, that tracks. I do not love it, but it tracks. Here is what I'm going to do. I'm going to think about what you said and then completely ignore it and do the wrong thing anyway, like a normal person. I said what I said and I stand by it, and I am also completely open to the possibility that I have no idea what I am talking about. The thing is, and I know this is not what you want to hear, but the thing is, you already know the answer to this. You just want someone to confirm it. Okay, look at me. Are you actually listening, or are you doing that thing where you look like you are listening, but you are actually just waiting for your turn to talk? Because I can tell. I am going to give you my honest opinion. And my honest opinion is that both options are bad, but one of them is slightly less bad, and sometimes that is all you get. I did not say it was a good plan. I said it was the plan. Those are two very different things. Lesson 7. Closing philosophy and the thinking mind. We arrive at the final lesson. And in this final lesson, we are going to shadow something that is, in many ways, the most difficult of all. The language of reflection. Of looking back and forward simultaneously. Of holding uncertainty with grace. Of speaking about life with the mix of honesty and hope that the most thoughtful English speakers reach for when they are trying to say something true. This is the English of a person who has lived and thought about living and tried to speak about it carefully. It is the English we are ultimately training toward. Not just the mechanics of fluency, but the capacity to speak with substance. To say something that matters. Shadow, all the way to the end? I have been thinking about what it means to learn something, really learn something, not just understand it intellectually, but carry it in a way that changes how you move through the world, because there is a version of learning that stays at the surface, where information enters your mind, gets processed, gets filed, and then sits there in perfectly organized storage, available for retrieval but completely disconnected from action. This is the kind of learning that produces people who can tell you, in precise detail, why exercise is beneficial while not exercising, who can articulate the psychology of procrastination while procrastinating, who understand, with real sophistication, the habits of mind that are holding them back, while continuing to hold them back. This is not stupidity. It is not even failure, exactly. It is a misunderstanding of what learning actually requires. Learning that changes you is not primarily about information. It is about experience. It is about doing the thing until the thing becomes part of you. Until the knowledge lives in your hands and your choices and your instincts, not just in your brain. And this is why I believe the most important educational tool is not a book or a classroom or a lecture, though all of these matter. The most important educational tool is doing, is the repeated, imperfect, often frustrating practice of the actual thing you are trying to learn. You are doing that right now. You are not studying English, you are doing English. You are producing it in real time, under pressure, with your voice and your breath, and the full engagement of your speaking body. And every sentence you shadow is a small act of learning that goes deeper than information. That begins to change the way English lives in you. I want to say something about persistence, because I think persistence is one of the most misunderstood qualities in human life. We talk about persistence as though it is a character trait, as though some people simply have more of it than others, the way some people have better eyesight. And there is some truth to that. Temperament varies. Tolerance for frustration varies. The capacity to hold a long-term goal in mind while navigating short-term difficulty varies. But persistence is also, in large part, a skill. And like all skills, it can be developed. Not by gritting your teeth harder or telling yourself more firmly that you should not give up, but by doing the smaller and more practical work of designing your environment, your habits, and your expectations in ways that make persistence more likely. The people who seem most persistent are often not the people with the most willpower. They are the people who have most effectively removed the conditions under which willpower becomes necessary. They have made the right choice, the easy choice, or at least the easier choice, and they have made the wrong choice slightly harder to access. They have also, typically, made peace with the non-linear nature of progress. They do not require each day to be better than the previous one. They do not interpret a bad day as evidence that the project has failed. They understand that progress, in almost any domain worth pursuing, looks less like a straight upward line and more like a long, noisy, seemingly chaotic oscillation that trends upward over months and years when you look at it from far enough away. The frustration of the close-up view is the price of any long-term pursuit. And developing the capacity to step back, to take the long view, to remind yourself where you are in the arc of a longer story, that is a cognitive skill as learnable as any other. And it may be the single most important skill for anyone who wants to do something that takes a long time to do. Let me say something about English itself, and about what you are actually learning when you learn to think in a language. Every language is a way of organizing reality. The words available in a language are not just labels for pre-existing things. They are, in a very real sense, the shape of what can be thought within that language. Languages differ in the concepts they make easy, in the distinctions they require you to draw, in the relationships between ideas that their grammar makes visible. When you learn to think in English, you are not just gaining access to communication with more people, though you are certainly gaining that. You are gaining access to a particular way of organizing experience, a particular set of concepts and distinctions and ways of framing problems that have been refined by hundreds of years of speakers across an enormous range of cultures and disciplines. You are gaining the possibility of thinking thoughts that could not be thought, or at least could not be thought as easily, without the specific tools that English provides. And this is a form of cognitive expansion, an enlargement of the possible. This is why thinking in English, not translating but actually thinking, is not just a practical achievement. It is an intellectual one. It is adding a new instrument to the orchestra of your mind, one that can play some notes that the other instruments cannot reach, while the other instruments play notes that English cannot reach either. And this is why I have always believed that the most fluent speakers of multiple languages are not divided but multiplied. They are not torn between identities. They are enriched by the perspectives that each language opens. They have access to more ways of seeing and more ways of saying, which means more ways of thinking and more ways of being. You are building toward that. Every session like this one is a stone laid in that foundation, not a dramatic stone, not a noticeable stone, just one more placed carefully where the next one can rest on it. And I want to close with this. You started this video an hour ago or close to it as someone who wanted to train their brain to think in English. You were probably, like almost everyone, slightly skeptical, slightly tired, wondering if this was really going to be different from the other things you have tried. And I cannot tell you if it is. I cannot measure what happened in your brain during this hour. I cannot verify whether the seeds of something have been planted or whether today was one of those days when you showed up and nothing seemed to take. But I can tell you what I know about how language learning actually works. It works in the hours when you do not feel it working. It works in the practice sessions that feel mechanical and effortful and far from the effortless fluency you are reaching toward. It works in the accumulated repetition of doing the thing again and again with patience and without the expectation of dramatic results on any given day. The brain is a remarkable organ. It is plastic in ways that were not understood until very recently. It reshapes itself around what you do consistently. The circuits that handle English, the circuits responsible for producing English in real time without translation, are being thickened and strengthened by exactly the kind of work you did today. You may not feel it yet. That is fine. The feeling comes later, sometimes much later, but the work comes first, always the work first. So, here is what I want you to take from this hour. Not a grammatical rule, not a vocabulary list, not a technique to remember and apply. I want you to take the felt experience of an hour spent producing English, of having your mouth and your mind working in the same language at the same time, of having stayed with it even when it was hard, even when you fell behind, even when the sentences outran you for a moment. That experience is real. The neural activity that produced it is real. The pathway that an hour of that work has widened, even slightly, is real. Come back tomorrow, shadow something else. Come back the next day, and the next. Not because each individual session will feel transformative, but because the accumulation of those sessions is the transformation, and one day, without warning, in the middle of a sentence in English, you will realize that you did not translate it. It arrived in English. It left your mouth in English. And somewhere between the arrival and the leaving, no other language was involved. That moment is waiting for you. It exists. It is real. And the only path to it runs directly through the work. Keep going. You are already further than you were an hour ago. And an hour from now, if you begin again, you will be further still. That is how this works. And you are doing it. So keep going. Continuing directly from where the script ended. Continuation. The mind that will not stop. There is something I want to address before we fully close this session, and it is something that comes up for almost every serious language learner at some point in their journey. It is the voice in your head that says you are not progressing fast enough. The voice that compares your current ability to where you want to be and finds the gap discouraging rather than motivating. The voice that watches someone else speak English effortlessly and whispers, "I will never sound like that." I want to spend a few minutes with that voice because it deserves a response, and the response matters for whether you continue with this work or quietly abandon it the way so many learners do, not because they lacked ability, but because they lacked a framework for understanding what was actually happening to them. Shadow everything I say, right to the end. The gap between where you are and where you want to be is not evidence that you are failing. It is evidence that you have a clear vision of excellence. And a clear vision of excellence is one of the rarest and most valuable things a learner can possess. Most people who give up on language learning do not give up because it is too hard. They give up because the difficulty feels personal. They interpret struggle as a statement about their intelligence or their capacity rather than as the normal texture of any meaningful learning process. But struggle is not personal. Struggle is structural. It is built into the architecture of genuine learning. And the learners who make it through, the ones who eventually arrive at that effortless fluency you are reaching for, are not the ones who found it easier. They are the ones who stopped interpreting difficulty as failure and started interpreting it as information. Information about where the edges of their current ability are, information about which specific aspects of the language need more attention, information about what kind of practice will produce the most growth at this particular stage of their development. Difficulty is not the enemy of progress. Difficulty is the medium in which progress occurs. You cannot get strong without resistance. You cannot get fluent without the friction of real-time production. You cannot train your brain to think in English without the repeated, uncomfortable experience of trying to think in English before your brain is fully ready. The discomfort you feel in those moments is not a sign that something is wrong. It is the sensation of your brain doing exactly what it is supposed to do. Keep shadowing. I want to talk about the specific challenge of accent, because for many learners, accent is the most emotionally charged part of English fluency. It is the part that feels most exposed, most personal, most connected to identity and pride and the fear of being judged. And I want to say something that I hope you will hear carefully. Your accent is not a problem to be eliminated. Your accent is a history to be carried with confidence. Every native English speaker has an accent, every single one. There is no accent-free English. There is received pronunciation and general American and Australian English and Singaporean English and Nigerian English and Pakistani English and Indian English and Jamaican English, and none of these is more or less English than the others. They are different rivers fed by the same source. The goal of accent work is not to sound like someone you are not. The goal is intelligibility. The goal is clarity. The goal is the confidence to speak without hiding. The goal is to produce English sounds with enough precision that your listener can follow you easily, so that your accent becomes the frame around your ideas rather than a barrier to them. When you shadow, you are working on this, not by erasing your native sound, but by internalizing the rhythm and stress and intonation of English speech, the music of it. And that music, when it becomes part of your speaking voice, does something that pronunciation drills alone can never fully achieve. It makes you sound like someone who belongs in the language, not because your vowels are perfect, but because the way you move through sentences has the shape and the timing of fluency. That shape is what you have been building all session, and it is going to keep building every time you come back. Now, I want to give you something practical, a framework for the next 30 days of your shadowing practice. Because the worst thing that could happen after a session like this is that you feel inspired for 2 days and then drift back to passive consumption. Inspiration without structure evaporates. Structure without inspiration is dull. But when you combine genuine motivation with a clear practice plan, you create the conditions for the kind of sustained effort that actually changes you. Here is the framework. For the next 30 days, you are going to shadow for a minimum of 15 minutes every single day. Not a long time, 15 minutes. Short enough that there is almost never a legitimate reason to skip it, long enough, done daily, to produce measurable change in your brain over 30 days. The first 10 days, shadow content that is at or slightly below your comfortable level. Use this session if you want. Use other material. The goal is not to be challenged by the content. The goal is to build the habit, to make the physical act of shadowing automatic, to make speaking English out loud for 15 minutes every day just something you do, the way you brush your teeth, without negotiating with yourself about whether today is a good day for it. The second 10 days, step up the difficulty. Shadow content that stretches you. That has vocabulary you have to reach for, sentence structures that are longer and more complex than what you naturally produce, delivery that is faster than comfortable. This is where the real neural building happens. This is where the edges of your current ability are being pushed outward. The third 10 days, shadow, and then record yourself. This is the step most learners skip because listening to yourself is uncomfortable, but it is also irreplaceable. Recording and listening is the only way to hear what your English actually sounds like, as opposed to what you think it sounds like. It is the feedback mechanism that turns practice into improvement. Do not edit the recordings. Do not try to produce a perfect version. Just shadow for 15 minutes, record it, listen back once, notice 2 or 3 specific things, and move on. By the end of 30 days, you will not be a native speaker. That is not the goal, and it was never the goal. But you will be measurably different from the person you are right now. Your brain will have new grooves worn into it by 30 days of daily English production. Your mouth will be more comfortable producing English sounds. Your internal monologue will have started, at least in moments, to run in English without you consciously directing it. And that shift, small as it sounds, is the beginning of everything. Shadow this. Day 1, you show up, you are tired, you are not particularly motivated, the 15 minutes feels long. You stumble through sentences that should be easy. You finish feeling like you have not accomplished much. Day 1 is the most important day, because day 1 is when you decide that this is a practice, not a performance. That you are not doing this because it feels good, you are doing it because it works. And it works regardless of how it feels. Day 7. Something small happens. A sentence comes out more smoothly than you expected. A transition that required conscious effort last week flows without friction. You do not make a big deal of it. You note it, you continue. Day 14. You find yourself thinking a thought in English while doing something unrelated to English study. Walking somewhere, making something, staring out a window. The thought arrives in English before you have a chance to translate it. It is small. It is partial, but it is real. Something has changed. Day 21. You have a real conversation in English with a native speaker or a fluent speaker, and halfway through you realize that you have not been translating, that the English is flowing more directly than it used to, that the gap between thought and speech has narrowed, not disappeared, narrowed, and narrowed is enough. Narrowed is progress, narrowed is the beginning. Day 30. You look back at where you started. You remember what 15 minutes of shadowing felt like on day 1. The effort it required, the stumbling, the discomfort, and you compare it to what 15 minutes feels like now. Easier, more natural. Not effortless yet, but genuinely easier. And you understand, in a way that no description could have made you understand before doing it, that 30 days of small daily work has built something real inside you. And then day 31 arrives, and you do it again. Because this is not a 30-day program. It is the beginning of a practice. And a practice, by definition, does not end when the initial momentum runs out. A practice is what you do. It becomes part of who you are. And the version of you who thinks in English, who responds in English, who tells stories and arguments and jokes and apologies and declarations and observations in English without that exhausting lag of translation, that version of you is built, one 15-minute session at a time, by the person you are right now, today, choosing to keep going. Let me leave you with one final passage to shadow. Make it count. Put everything into it. This is the last stretch of the session, and I want your voice to be fully in it. Language is one of the oldest technologies in human history. It predates writing by tens of thousands of years. It predates agriculture, cities, governments, and every institution we have built to organize collective life. Language is older than all of it, and it is the foundation on which all of it rests. And yet, for all its antiquity, for all the millennia over which it has been practiced and refined and passed down and transformed, language remains a fundamentally intimate act. Every sentence is spoken by a body, heard by another body, and the space between the two is not just air but relationship, meaning traveling from one person to another, imperfect, approximate, richer than the words alone carry, dependent on context and tone and history and trust. When you learn to speak a language with fluency, you are not learning a technical skill in the ordinary sense of that phrase. You are learning to enter a relationship. You are learning to participate in a form of human contact that has been ongoing for longer than civilization itself. You are learning to be a voice in the longest conversation ever held. That is not a small thing. That is an extraordinary thing. And the fact that it requires effort, that it asks something real from you, is not a bug in the design. It is appropriate. Things worth having ask something of us. That is part of how we know they are worth having. You have done real work today. You have spoken English for close to an hour. You have produced thousands of sentences. You have pushed your brain into configurations it did not comfortably occupy before. You have done something that the passive version of learning can never do for you. Take that seriously, not with arrogance, but with respect. Respect for the work, respect for the fact that you showed up and stayed with it, respect for the person you are in the process of becoming, the one who thinks and speaks and lives more fully in the language you have chosen to make your own. Come back tomorrow and the day after, and keep going, because somewhere on the other side of consistent daily practice, English is waiting for you, not as a subject to study, as a language to live in. And you are going to get there.